Hey everybody! So I am really excited about this blog post that I'm posting tomorrow. Well, I guess it'll be today when you watch this video and when you read the post. But this blog post took a lot of work, a lot of research, and I'm still working through a lot of research. But it was motivated because I am going to be moderating a discussion with some local sheriffs here in North Carolina. I should change that. Local sheriff candidates here in North Carolina. So I'm going to be going to a meeting tonight, giving a little constitutional speech, and then asking the sheriffs different questions or the candidates different questions. And so because I was asked to do that, I was really aware of my own lack of knowledge when it comes to the role of sheriff, the office of sheriff, the PD, the city police, everything that goes on with law enforcement. I know, vaguely speaking, what it entails, but when it comes to brass tacks and what it really is, I struggle really knowing exactly what that position is constitutionally, where their realms of power start and end, so on and so forth. And so my goal was to really dig in and grasp this whole realm of power that I'm less familiar with. And unfortunately, I can only look at one state at a time. And really, I can only look at my own state currently because that's where I'm living. That's what I'm interested in. So I am going to be looking at North Carolina's laws, North Carolina's statutes, North Carolina's constitution in regards to the office of the sheriff, the city PD, so on and so forth. With all that to say, I was blessed to meet a gentleman who is a retired police officer who knows a retired sheriff. So this weekend, I was able to talk with the retired sheriff as well as the retired police officer, police detective, and ask them a bunch of questions. And let me tell you, we talked for about 4 hours, and I asked them so many questions, and I felt like every question that I asked led to more questions. I'm still sort of reeling from it. There's still so much information that I don't really have fully grasped. But I did learn a lot, and it kind of led me to do more research and to learn even more. So I wrote an article. This is going to be publishing on Wednesday, which I believe will be February 2nd, talking about the specific constitutional role of the sheriff. Now, there's a lot to that, and I'm not going to be able to unpack all of that in one article. So I will probably spend a little more time digging into this over the course of a couple weeks. I also want to look at the difference between the office of the sheriff and the police department, which is a department. So I will start off giving just a little information here on video, and then I'm going to let you guys go read this article for yourself because it's long. There's a lot to it. You need to take time to sit down and sort of digest it for yourself. Maybe go to some of the links I put in there to do some of your own research. But I also used this, which is the Constitution for North Carolina, in working through the role. There's only a little bit in the Constitution specifically about the sheriff, which I marked here in this Constitution. And so I need to really delve into this a lot more. But I'm going to start out by saying one of the first things that the sheriff, or the retired sheriff that I was talking to, kind of corrected me on when I first started talking to him is I was like, the sheriff's department. And he was like, well, let me correct you on that. It's not a department. So maybe this is common knowledge to people, but I didn't really know this, or I had never really kind of digested this before. But the sheriff's department is an incorrect. It's a misnomer. It is called the office of the sheriff, and with real good reason. So we have a police department, we have a department of education, a department of this, a department of that. And department, the word literally entails a government agency that is hired directly by someone else in the government, paid by them, and they are subject or subordinate to someone in government. So in other words, at the police level, we have a PD, here we have a city police department and a city chief of police, right? And the chief of police is actually going to be hired by either the city manager or the, I believe it was the city council. City council or even the mayor. And this group of people who hires him are therefore his direct bosses or her direct boss. So this chief of police is going to be accountable to whoever hired them and going to have specific job descriptions and duties based on that. And they can be fired by these people as well. And the department, the police department, is a department of the government. It is directly subject to and accountable to other levels of government. The office of the sheriff is the polar opposite of that, which is why it holds the name office. And so as I was researching and reading more about this, because this retired sheriff corrected me on this, I was realizing that it's just the same as the office of the president or the office of the governor or any office that's political office. We call them an office because they are directly accountable to and directly hired by the citizenry. So we directly elect sheriffs in this country, which is the only directly elected law enforcement agent in the entire country. And it is the only constitutional law enforcement agent in the entire country. In other words, this is the office of the sheriff is a direct creation of the Constitution. So a police department or the chief of police could be eliminated or created by law, but this means that it's subject to law. Its existence is literally subject to law. The existence of the office of the sheriff is not subject to law. It is a constitutionally created office. So therefore, this means that the sheriff has a vast amount of discretion in his realm of power because he is directly elected by the people. Therefore, there is no direct superior to the sheriff in his realm of power. Now, his realm of power is confined to a county. For the most part, it's counties in the United States. There are a couple places that are called parishes. There may be a few other names, but the county is where the sheriff is going to more or less be the chief law enforcement officer. You could almost call him the president of the county. And he has deputy sheriffs who will be subject directly to him and acting as his agents. They are essentially mini sheriffs, right? This is so much information, but it's amazing to have been able to learn. And so this discretion allows the sheriff to operate more freely in his realm of power, right? He is not directly subject to any direct superior other than the people and the Constitution. And so this is where the Constitution really comes into play. So the North Carolina Constitution here in my state created the role of sheriff, okay? And there is no role of sheriff in the federal Constitution. The federal Constitution does not have a role of sheriff. It doesn't exist. So the role of sheriff is completely subject to whether or not the state constitution creates that role. Now, the states didn't actually have an elected sheriff's position initially. So the first, I believe it was New Jersey and one other state. I could look it up. I believe it was New Jersey and who was it? What state was it? Pennsylvania. New Jersey and Pennsylvania were the first two states to actually work the role of sheriff, the office of sheriff, in their constitutions as early as 1776. But no other states had that in their constitutions. Ohio then included it as an elected, as an elected position. And slowly but steadily, all the other states started to do the same. I don't think every single state has one. As the research that I was doing, I found that there are approximately 3,083 sheriffs currently, and about 98% of them are elected by their citizens. Okay, so about 2% of sheriffs are not elected. So the majority of sheriffs in the entire United States are elected. And this is because the constitutions of these states have put their positions in the Constitution themselves. Now, different states will have different details in their constitutions about this role, this position. But in North Carolina, the role is defined by a statute, by an actual law. So the law kind of gives a broad overview of the powers of the sheriff and the sheriff's office, or the office of the sheriff. So I'm going to read you briefly what the law here in North Carolina says, okay? So the sheriff, this is per a specific law. It's called NCGE 17, where it defines and talks about the role of the sheriff. And it says the sheriff is the only officer of local government required by the Constitution. The sheriff, in addition to his criminal justice responsibilities, is the only officer who is also responsible for the courts of the state and acting as their bailiff and marshal. The sheriff administrates and executes criminal and civil justice and acts as the ex officio detention officer. So essentially, the deputy sheriff has been held by the Supreme Court of the state to hold an office and special trust and confidence, acting with the powers of the sheriff. So in North Carolina, the sheriff's powers are not very specifically defined, right? They're rather loose, probably with reason, with purpose, and they're loose so that the sheriff can act rather freely within his realm of power over his citizenry, protecting his citizenry, providing law and order. And so this is what I really want to hone in on in this little segment here. You can go read a lot of the more nitty-gritty details, but what I really want to hone in on here is that the sheriff has this very juxtapositional position. He has a very juxtapositional role. And what I mean by this is that we need sheriffs, right? We need law enforcement. Why? If you listen to anything that I talk about on a daily, bi-daily basis, you would understand that government is necessary per a lot of theories that we've gone through from Locke and Hobbes, Montesquieu, others. It's necessary because if we don't have government, we live in a state of war. We live in this state of anarchy where there is no law and order, and therefore there is no liberty since there is no law and order, right? When there's no law, people are free to do whatever they want and people live in anarchy. So we need law. But the problem is if we have law, that law needs to be confined. Those making those laws need to be confined because the same people who needed law in the first place, being put in positions of power to make law, are just as likely to abuse that power. But now they have more power to abuse, right? And so we end up putting ourselves in a position where we could be abused worse under a state of law than we were in a state of no law. So the remedy for this is creating constitutions, is creating job descriptions that clearly define and therefore confine the powers of those in government, the powers of those creating and writing these laws. So then we have this interesting position of the sheriff. So the sheriff is essentially representing law. He is the law. People would call him the law back in the 1800s when you would go west, right? He's the law. They'd say, "Are you the law?" He's the law. He represents the law, meaning he represents government. But because he's sheriff and because he's elected by the people, he doesn't necessarily represent government as much as he represents law, okay? And this is where things get interesting because he is tasked with protecting his citizenry by enforcing the law, providing criminal justice. He's providing criminal justice to the community, okay? Justice for criminals, right? However, at the same time, he's required to take an oath, 3 oaths actually. And these oaths, for the most part, all begin and end with maintaining and protecting both the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of North Carolina and any laws made not in contrast to those constitutions, okay? So because the office of the sheriff is in this position of both enforcing the law, maintaining law and order, while at the same time making sure that he's maintaining and defending this Constitution, he is both acting as the law and protecting his citizens from the law. I hope that this makes sense. It's fascinating to me the way that this works. The sheriff has a very unique role. He is not only tasked with making sure law is followed, but he's also tasked with making sure the laws that he makes sure are followed are within the confines of the Constitution. He not only protects the citizenry from themselves, but his job is also to protect the citizenry from himself and from the government at large, and from any unjust, unconstitutional, or arbitrary laws. Therefore, he holds this very weighty, gravity-laden position where he is actually required to have an immense amount of personal reverence and respect for the Constitution. Because if he does not, he can be the most useful and effective tool of a tyrant, right? An arbitrary, unconfined sheriff who has no respect, no love of the law, no reverence for the Constitution, or even for his role in defending and maintaining this Constitution, can be liberty's worst enemy and the tyrant's best friend. And yet at the same time, if this sheriff has a grasp of the Constitution that he took an oath to maintain and protect, if this sheriff understands the gravity of arbitrary, unconfined powers coming from those above him, and when I say above, I don't mean that he's a direct subordinate to, but those creating the laws he's going to be required to enforce, if he understands the gravity of laws that are outside of the confines of the Constitution and what that does to liberty, and if he understands his role in protecting the Constitution from anything that would damage it, and thereby protecting his own citizenry, he turns out to be the greatest enemy of a tyrant and the greatest friend of liberty. Does this make sense? This blows my mind. He could very literally, the sheriff and the sheriff's deputy could very literally be the hands of tyranny. They are the closest to us. They are the ones that on a day-to-day basis are actually acting out the Constitution. Every interaction they have with a citizen is the Constitution coming into play with law and the citizen, the Constitution being that bridge, bridging that law and that citizen, protecting that citizen from that law. So whoever takes this role, this position of sheriff, has an incredibly weighty job. I don't know if I can emphasize this enough, and there's so much more I could get into that maybe I'll do a second video to unpack this even more. But the role of sheriff is critical because he both protects the citizens from themselves and he protects the citizens from himself and from the government at large. If he's asked to do something that would destroy liberty or violate his citizens' rights, he is the last line of defense. He is the last one who has the precious jewel, that decision. He holds that last decision. It comes down to him. Will he or won't he be an arm of an arbitrary government? Now, I'm not talking about an arbitrary sheriff. That's another story entirely. I'm looking at, will the sheriff, when required by local government or state government, if required to do something outside of the confines of the Constitution he swore an oath to, will he choose to simply act as a mindless arbiter of law? Or will he take on the personal responsibility of his oath and protect his citizens no matter the cost? That's a incredibly weighty question. And one that I hope all of the sheriffs and deputy sheriffs around this country consider, and those candidates that are thinking of these roles deeply consider. This is no small matter. Countries throughout history have found that the greatest abuses of liberty, the greatest abuses of power have come from those lower level magistrates who are simply arms of those in power. Hitler and his entire rule depended on the enforcement of what he did by those lower level officers. Do we have officers who simply think of themselves as arms of the law and nothing else? Or do we have officers who think of themselves as arms of the law, but representatives and defenders of the Constitution that confines that law? That's the critical question. That's the question we should all be asking anyone running for office of the sheriff. There's so much more I could say. But I hope this is impacting you. I hope that you're taking in and considering just how weighty this position is. Liberty begins and ends at this position. This is the last line of defense. And let me clarify something. Technically, sheriffs and local law enforcement are not empowered to enforce federal law. And federal law enforcement, which we could get into the constitutionality of them, but federal law enforcement are not empowered to enforce local or state law. So then the question really comes into play. What happens then if the federal government decides to mandate or through executive order or write a law that is incredibly damaging to liberty and highly unconstitutional? For instance, the internment of Japanese Americans, right? 700,000 of them rounded up against their own will, their properties taken away from them unlawfully. The sheriffs would not have been required to do this. It would have been the federal government coming in to do this. And I asked one of the retired law enforcement officers that I was speaking with this weekend, I asked him what would happen in this scenario, because it's not even like the sheriff can say no. And he said it very literally at that point would be a standoff. Again, how seriously do those in law enforcement take their role? Is it just a position of power and ability to enforce their power over others? Is it just a position of doing whatever they're told blindly? Or is it a position of weight and gravity, one that fully requires that they understand the breadth of the Constitution, arbitrary power, and the severity of what could happen should they just blindly follow laws that they're given? So with that, I'm going to end. I will come back because there's so much more to this. Please go read the whole entire article because I break down a lot of this in much more detail. And I think it will really sort of crystallize what I was saying here into much more clarity. All right. Well, until next time.